AB.
For those of you joining in, we'll be starting in about a minute. So grab a cup of coffee or tea and get settled in. Welcome to all of you. We're going to get started now. I know people are still joining, but we've got a lot to discuss, so we do want to get started. I'm here to welcome you to this webinar on how Brazil beat back authoritarianism. We hope you'll be inspired and learn lessons for the work you are doing here in the United States or wherever you work. I'm John Cavanna from the Institute for Policy Studies. IPS believes that we're stronger when we collaborate, and so today's event is a collaboration with the Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR, and the Washington, Brazil office. Check them out, great institutions. Today's session is part of a monthly series put together by IPS's amazing foreign policy team, Manuel Perez Rocha, Christine Ahn, Phyllis Bennis, and others. And the series is called Lessons from Resistance to Authoritarianism Around the World. Some of you joined us in April for a session on the Philippines with Walden Bello. May on South Korea, sorry, in March, Walden was March. Then in April, we had Christine Ahn leading a fabulous panel on South Korea. It's every third Thursday of the month. The YouTubes of the first two are on the IPS YouTube channel. And for future sessions on other countries, check out the IPS website, and we'll put a link to that in the chat. Let me also urge you to sign up for our IPS newsletter and our events calendar. We'll put a link about that as well. Now, to today's moderator for the discussion that is about to unfold here. Alex Main is Director of International Policy at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR. He is a member of the board of directors of the Washington, Brazil office. His areas of expertise include global economic governance, Latin America and Caribbean integration, and US policy in the Western Hemisphere. Alex's analyses have been published in numerous outlets, including the New York Times and Le Monde Diplomatique. Welcome, Alex, and take it away.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone out there for joining us today. It's a real honor for CEPR to be co-sponsoring such a great panel with experts who are really much more than just experts on Brazil. You know, they're activists, and they've been at the heart of popular struggles there. And CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, for those that don't know us, is a small but mighty think tank in DC focused on economic issues and also US foreign policy, particularly in Latin America. And we've published many articles and reports on the impact of US policies in Brazil and other countries in Latin America. And you can find all that at cepr.net. And so today we're going to be focusing on Brazil's most recent experience with authoritarianism. But before we all plunge into that topic, it's worth, I think, just remembering that this isn't Brazil's first serious run-in with authoritarianism in its recent history. In 1964, a US-backed military coup toppled the progressive government of João Goulart and installed a right-wing military dictatorship that lasted over 2 decades. There was widespread censorship and repression involving institutionalized torture and rape and hundreds of extrajudicial killings and disappearances targeting left-wing activists primarily. This year's Brazilian Oscar winner called I'm Still Here, it won the International Feature Film category, I believe, tells the chilling story of one of the many forced disappearances that took place during that dark time and the deep scars that it left within a family and a community. And as with other Latin American dictatorships of the Cold War era, Brazil's military regime received strong support and assistance from the US. Though there was a short-lived Truth Commission that investigated a number of crimes of the military dictatorship, a blanket amnesty has protected implicated military and government officials from prosecution. And the crimes of that dictatorship and the US's involvement in its crimes have yet to be fully reckoned with. But now let's fast forward. In 2018, Jair Bolsonaro, a former low-level army officer and legislator who had been mostly known for his angry, misogynistic, racist outbursts and his constant praise for Brazil's former military dictatorship, was elected president. And I won't go into the horrors that Brazil endured during his administration. I'll let our far more knowledgeable panelists get into that. What I will mention now is what happened at the end of Bolsonaro's term in office, given the very uncanny parallels with what we saw here in the US. First, when Bolsonaro lost the 2022 presidential election, he and his supporters contested the results and launched what could be described as a sort of stop the steal campaign of disinformation and protests. And that sounds awfully familiar, right? And then on January 8th, 2023, a mob of Bolsonaro supporters descended on Brazil's capital, Brasilia, and broke into the Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, vandalized the place, and were attempting essentially to take over the government. They were eventually forced to leave, but it left the country extremely rattled. And I think that probably sounds pretty familiar as well. And so, was this just a remarkable coincidence? Probably not. But our esteemed panelists will, I expect, be discussing the close ties between the Bolsonaro clan and Trump and MAGA. And what I will say is that, as in other countries, Trump, who first came to power 2 years before Bolsonaro, inspired and emboldened the far right in Brazil, and of course in many other places. And, Trump and MAGA provided a playbook that these authoritarian figures followed. A judicial investigation in Brazil recently revealed that Bolsonaro officials, and probably Bolsonaro himself, were deeply implicated in a violent military coup plan that was very nearly executed. But that coup didn't happen, and for now, Brazil's democracy remains intact. And our panelists today are going to talk to us about how that happened, how Brazilians managed to successfully, for now, beat back authoritarianism. And I know that they're also going to talk to us about one very key variable that was crucial in Brazil, and I think could be crucial for us here in the US, which is solidarity. A movement of international solidarity and support for progressive forces in Brazil actually began a few years before Bolsonaro's election, when democracy was first under attack in 2016. But I know our panelists will be delving into that topic, so let's kick off this panel. And the format of this will be that each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes or so. Then we're going to have a short reflective discussion, about 15 minutes or so, with the panelists. And then we're going to open it up to questions, and everyone in the audience can post their questions in the Q&A box, which you should be able to see at the bottom of the Zoom window. And you know, our audience members, please feel free to, start posting those questions as soon as you like, and we will try to address as many as we can. But let's get started with our first panelist, uh, Jana Silverman, Professor Jana Silverman, who holds a PhD in labor economics from the Universidade Estadual de Campinas, Unicamp, in Brazil, with postdoctoral studies completed at the Center for Global Workers' Rights at Penn State University. She's currently appointed as visiting professor of international relations at the Universidade Federal do ABC in São Bernardo do Campo, Brazil. And in addition, Dr. Silverman is the General Secretary of the Associação Docente da UFABC, doing my best here, Jana, and a member of the steering committee of the Democratic Socialists of America International Committee. Yeah, thank you, Jana.
Great, thanks for the introduction, and thanks to everyone at IPS, at CEPR, and also at the Washington, Brazil office for this invitation to speak to everybody today. So I've been tasked, an almost impossible task perhaps, to give a bit of a historical overview before we look into the current political, economic, and social situation in Brazil to really kind of to answer what to me is more of a question is, did Brazil actually beat back authoritarianism in recent years, or to what extent it did, and what strategies have been implemented, right? So I think to open this up, I would start by saying authoritarianism and the far right is actually in the DNA of the construction of Brazil itself, and in particular in Brazil's elites, right? Brazil is a country that was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888. So we're talking about over 450 years in which the economy was largely based off of the use of slave labor. Over 4 million Africans were enslaved and brought to Brazil specifically to work in mines and sugarcane plantations, and that formed the basis of the colonial economy. And Brazil also, Brazil was also a country, the colonial development of Brazil was very different from the development of the United States. It had very little autonomy from the colonial power, which was Portugal. There was very little development of a sort of middle class or an intellectual class during the 400 years of colonialism. So, for example, there was no universities developed in Brazil, while Brazil was a colony. So everybody had to, the sons of the ruling elite had to be educated in Portugal and other countries in Europe, right? It kind of created a bit of this sort of mentality in which sort of everything outside of Brazil is better. We kind of call this the stray dog mentality, the vida machismo, as we say in Portuguese, right? And it's created a sort of famous social scientist, Jesse de Souza, has called this the backwards elite, the elite do atraso. So basically, a governing elite, an economic elite, a political elite, which really had no interest in building autonomous development in the country, right? And this also comes out of the fact that Brazil is the only country in South America that did not have a war of independence. Independence was declared literally by the son of the Portuguese emperor, right? So this is all goes to show that there's sort of, in the entire history of Brazil, there's been kind of a parallel political track happening. So on one hand, you have this, again, very reactionary elite, slave owning, really profiting off of the inherent institutional, historical, racial, and geographic inequalities that are so deep in Brazil. And on the other hand, you have also another parallel track of resistance, right? Of organization, of slave rebellions, of rebellions led by indigenous people, of unionists, of social movements, of political parties like the Partido dos Trabalhadores, right? Which is, Brazil's largest left-wing party, which, Lula is the principal leader, right? Which is currently in government. So again, it's a very peculiar country in that you sort of have these two tracks politically that have been competing kind of within themselves basically throughout the entire history of the country, right? Even if we look going way, back to the 1930s, when you have the process of industrial economic modernization. I mean, that modernization doesn't happen under a sort of progressive president like FDR in the United States. It happens under a dictator, Getulio Vargas, who is kind of a populist dictator. He legalizes unions, he creates a minimum wage, but at the same time, he viciously represses his political opponents, including members of the Brazilian Communist Party, and doesn't allow elections for 15 years. So again, it's kind of a very peculiar, I would say, kind of, there are a lot of things in common with the United States when we look at Brazil in terms of, we look at, geographic and racial cleavages in particular, but also some very, particular political characteristics. So coming out of, again, I'm not going to get too much into the dictatorship, which I think Alex made some very insightful comments about, again. But thinking about how was that transition out of the dictatorship? So again, in the late 1970s, you have sort of a joint sort of social and political movement, as well as economic sort of tendency that sort of leads to what we call kind of a distension of the worst repression, which happens from the late 1960s to the mid 1970s under the Brazilian dictatorship, military dictatorship. And interestingly enough, and this is something that came out in the beginning of the year after the passing away of President Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter actually had a fairly important role in the late 1970s, questioning the dictatorship, meeting with opposition leaders, him and Rosalind Carter as well. But above and beyond the U.S. influence, you had sort of an economic slowdown coupled with the rise of strong independent social movements for the first time that were able to kind of get some space to breathe once the sort of heaviest repression was starting to end. And out of that, you have Lula arise as the sort of a new form of union leader, national union leader, coming out of the area in which I live and work in São Bernardo do Campo, which is kind of the industrial belt that surrounds the major city of Sao Paulo. And out of that, again, you have these other innovations. You have a women's movement that's created. You have LGBTQ movement that's created. You have an Afro-Brazilian movement that's strengthened. And out of this sort of growing progressive milieu, which is again pressuring not only for specific demands around salaries, et cetera, or the end to racial inequality, pressing for redemocratization, right? And so out of that, you have the creation of the Workers' Party, the Partido dos Trabalhadores, which becomes sort of the political expression of that. But what happens in 1985, the transition out of the dictatorship, it's different from the transition, say, in countries like Uruguay or Chile, where there was much more of a popular or sort of a role by the populace itself. It was a transition that was basically agreed upon by these, economic and political elites. You didn't have direct elections in 1985 for the first, democratic president after the dictatorship. You only have the first democratic elections only happened in 1989 after the creation of a new constitution, which again has a lot of progressive elements, including expansion of, social rights, the creation of the creation of a national public healthcare system, the expansion of labor rights, especially to domestic workers, to public sector workers, but at the same time also, on an economic sense, also has very also lays the seeds for the implementation of neoliberalism, which happens in the 1990s. But kind of skipping ahead, because I know my time is also limited, we have in 2003, you have a massively important moment for Brazilian democracy, which is the inauguration, the election inauguration of the first center-left government in this new period after redemocratization, which is the Workers' Party government led by Lula, his first administration. And again, and so the Workers' Party governs governs through 2016, right? And in this time, Lula has, he serves 2 terms up until 2010. He's incredibly popular, but even in his most popular moments, you have, again, fractions of these elites, whether it's the financial elite, which doesn't like, some of his fiscal policies. You have obviously the media, which doesn't like the fact that he's kind of like this uncouth union leader who never, graduated from high school, right? And then when his successor, Dilma Rousseff, becomes president and takes office in 2011, she actually takes even more radical policies. She's the one who institutes the Truth Commission to start questioning the dictatorship. She's the one who starts to lower interest rates, which kind of messes with the profit-making schemes, especially of finance capital, right? Which is an important segment of the Brazilian economy, especially in places like Sao Paulo. And I would say even more importantly, she implements a series of very important policies to drastically reduce some of the major social and racial inequalities inherent in the country. So she institutes affirmative action policies for Afro-Brazilian and indigenous students in public universities, which before were seen as only places for the sons and daughters of the elite. And almost most importantly, I would say, on top of this all, she creates a law which basically it drastically increases the rights for domestic workers. Now, Brazil is a country, again, as part of this legacy of slavery, most middle-class families have domestic workers, right? And who are largely, obviously, poor Afro-Brazilian women. Now, after this law passed by Dilma, these women have to make, they earn the same amount of money and have the same kinds of labor rights and benefits as any other worker in the private sector, right? And so this was almost like a big shock for these elites, these backward elites, saying like, oh, now we have to treat our domestic workers, which before we could treat almost like slaves, as equals, right? As they were employees of any other company, right? And so you have this shock, you have, again, this cultural shock together with a sort of slowing down economy. And, then there's this opening given by the judiciary, which in the form of what's called the car wash scandal, the Lava Jato scandal, which again, we can get into this, and maybe this will come up more in the interventions of my colleagues here and in the questions, but this is basically a judicial, persecution, what we call now as lawfare, lobbied almost exclusively against the Workers' Party, basically implicating that Workers' Party leaders, including up to Lula himself, were part of this massive scandal, corruption scandal linked to the state-owned oil company, right? And we now know the U.S. Justice Department was completely implicated in this. We know this had again, private interests were completely, had a lot of stake in this, right? And all this bad press, and again, it's, like it was this scandal. There was basically this is what we're talking about in 2015, 2016, which was the height of the Lava Jato scandal. Literally, Workers' Party leaders, former party leaders, former senators, Congress people, former ministers going to prison literally every week. I remember it was every Friday, actually. They would do it as like a show, almost like an installation of your telenovela. And and in this climate, this actually, this climate that's completely hostile to the left, you have they create the seeds for the impeachment of President Dilma in 2016 on these absolutely these absolutely false grounds having to do with her fiscal policies. But in the end, it was what they called impeachment for what the right wing called the conjunto da obra, like all of her sins for basically being a progressive woman leader in Brazil, right? And so she, again, it's even though you have massive mobilization by unions, by social movements, there's the creation of what's called the Frente Brasil Popular and Frente Povo Sem Medo, which bring together social movements from all sort of tendencies across the left to fight against the impeachment. The impeachment goes through, and she's replaced by her vice president, who implements a very, scorched earth neoliberal policy. So again, Bolsonaro gets a lot of the attention of being sort of the classic kind of far right leader, who said, again, who kind of made, as Alex said, who made his career off of saying these horrible, comments, sexist and racist comments all the time when he was a congressperson for 20 years. But really sort of, I would say, at least thinking of from the perspective of the labor movement, which I work and study with, and I work and research on, the worst policies were actually implemented under Temer. You had a labor law reform implemented in 2017, which cripples the union movement, cripples it financially, restricts collective bargaining, creates new forms of precarious contracting, basically legalizes outsourcing in all forms, for any company, for any private employer. So you have the main backbone of this resistance to the authoritarianism, to the both the neoliberal and the neoliberal and the neo-fascist right is crippled because of this labor law reform. And so you have, again, Bolsonaro is elected under this, again, I'm sure Gonzalo and Stan will talk more to this very sort of surreal moment that was, fake news was being pumped in literally every moment of every day. Again, you have this background of the Lava Jato scandal still being uplifted. Lula is put in prison because of this scandal, right? Under these grounds, which have now all been completely invalidated by Brazil's Supreme Court. And even though you had, again, pockets of very strong resistance to this, it wasn't enough to break through this kind of bubble of, insanity is the only way I could use. But again, as Bolsonaro comes to office, and immediately, first of all, it's clear, just like Trump, that he's absolutely incapable of governing for anyone's benefit except for basically his own personal benefit and the benefit of his family, and also of the financial elites in the country. And his popularity starts to slide dramatically, especially during the pandemic. He's someone who basically, Brazil proportionally had more people die of COVID even than the United States. And this is despite the fact that Brazil has a very, very highly functioning, completely public healthcare sector, which reaches every, person in the country, which could have been the perfect vehicle to distribute vaccines. Bolsonaro deliberately did not chose not to deliver vaccines to people, deliberately, basically he even went on national TV saying, why are you crying? What do you expect me to do? I'm not a gravedigger, So it was really shocking policy. So even some of the elites and middle class that initially supported him started questioning that during the pandemic, because again, every family in Brazil has some family member who died of COVID, right? That's just how horrible the pandemic was here in Brazil. So you have, again, by 2021 or so, you have this diffuse movement starting to mobilize against him, which would have again, not particularly led by unions or social movements in particular. It was almost spontaneous, people saying, no, we want Bolsonaro out, for the Bolsonaro. And so you have, again, this combination of some again, segments of these political, economic, and social elites saying, no, Bolsonaro, again, he's killing our family members, he's driving the economy into the ground, he's not the person that we need anymore. And they finally, and this sort of diffuse popular discontent, which is manifested vis-a-vis these for Bolsonaro mobilizations in 2021, 2022. And then out of this, Lula surges as the sort of leader who, again, promises to create this broad political front encompassing basically everyone from the center right to the far left to fight against Bolsonaro. And again, he becomes candidate and wins in 2022. With that, I think I'll end here so we can have, we'll have my other colleagues take up to happen, kind of get into more of the details of what happened in 2022 and beyond.
Jana, thank you for that. Can you all hear me? Okay. Yeah, thank you, Jana, for that incredible overview, that deep dive into the history of past authoritarianism, but also the history of resistance. And of course, the more recent history that's fairly unknown here of the attacks on progressivism and democracy that took place before Bolsonaro's election, bolstered by this judicial persecution of Lula and other key figures, with support, by the way, of the U.S. Department of Justice. And I think our next panelist will probably get into some of that. So Stan is going to speak to us next. Stan Gasick is a North American labor lawyer having a close association of over 4 decades with Brazil, with Brazil's new unionism of the 1980s and with President Lula dating back to February of 1981. He was with Lula during his trial under the national security law of the Brazilian military dictatorship. And then he also visited President Lula in prison in Curitiba in May of 2019 during that judicial persecution. And prior to his release and eventual removal of all the baseless charges and lawfare waged against Lula. Stan served as deputy and interim director of the ILO mission in Brazil from 2011 to 2016. He's a member of the Washington Brazil Office Board of Directors and a member of the Advisory Council of the Brazil Institute, and received the Order of Merit for Labor Justice from the Brazilian Superior Labor Court in November of 2016 in recognition of his advocacy on behalf of international labor standards in Brazil. And he's been serving as senior advisor for global strategies at the UFCW since 2016. Stan, take it away.
Thank you very much, Alex. Good afternoon. Boa tarde a todos, a todas. Good afternoon from Washington. It's a great honor to be invited to this panel, and with my very dear colleagues, Jana Silverman, Gonzalo Aron, and Alex Main, all with whom I've had the great privilege of working directly throughout the years in relation to Brazil and Brazilian North American labor and civil society solidarity, and including with Professor Silverman on some recent publications concerning these very subjects. But before I venture into my kind of leitmotif for this discussion, which will be guided by Alex's questions as moderator during the reflection and discussion period, namely, what is the future of Brazil-U.S. relations under the Trump regime? I'd like to make the following points and reflections or inflections based on just the masterful historical trajectory and context which Professor Silverman just presented. First, the Michel Temer radical neoliberal labor law reform of 2017, which Jana mentioned, followed by the authoritarian Bolsonaro regime in 2019, brought about a devastating repression and financial hemorrhaging of the worker trade union movement. The movement is still trying to recover with the help of the current Lula administration, policies of the labor ministry, efforts at tripartite negotiation to develop a new actualization that would be more pro-worker and pro-union with regard to the future of labor relations. The Supreme Federal Court in Brazil, in a decision of 2023, has now given some sustainability to the equivalent of what we consider union security clauses and collective agreements in Brazil, which could give some more sustainability to the financial future of the labor movement. But all this adversity, I would argue, also contributed to kind of a new unity, an ironic unity within the labor movement and between the national trade union centrals, was driven by necessity and opposition to the regime. And it did lead to a certain invaluable support of the Lula Libre movement, pre-Lula movement, and with Lula's elections in 2022, Lula's re-election for his third term in 2022, including with a whole dimension of global trade union solidarity. The second point, inflection I'd like to make, is that there are continued unanswered questions concerning U.S. responsibility in the entire Lava Jato and lawfare episode against Lula, including during the Obama administration, unfortunately. There was a direct collaboration between DOJ and the Lava Jato operation, which is directed by prosecutor Deltan Dallagnol, and in collusion with federal judge Sergio Moro Curitiba, responsible for the initial sentencing of Lula. And important questions were directed to the Justice Department about the legality of this collaboration, including by Congressman Hank Johnson of the House Judiciary Committee. And these were met with unsatisfactory and incomplete answers from both the Barr and Garland administrations, in my humble opinion. And as Alex Main knows really well, there is the question of the treaty on prosecutorial cooperation and judicial cooperation between Brazil and the United States being arguably violated by the Department of Justice and the FBI, working directly with Dallagnol and company rather than directly with the Brazilian Justice Ministry, according to the treaty, and the Brazilian Justice Minister of the time in 2015, José Eduardo Cardoso. There's another point I'd like to make, inflection, and that is the issue of criminal conspiracy and treasonous insurrection on U.S. soil on January 6th of 2021, and on Brazilian soil on January 8th, 2023, which had been mentioned, but with more expeditious and thorough prosecution of those responsible on the Brazilian side for the most part, although right-wing forces in Brazil are continuing to push for the maximum amnesty possible for those who were involved. And the conventional wisdom of the mainstream press and of Washington foreign policy elite think tanks tepidly say that there was this tragic anti-democratic analogy in coincidence, when in fact there were direct causal links between both coup attempts, given the direct working alliances between Trump MAGA and the Bolsonaro camps, enabled by Steve Bannon and others. Eduardo Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro's son, and a Brazilian federal deputy, currently on leave, so to speak, was in Washington on January 6th to go to insurrection school, as it were. There's another point I would like to make, and that is there is also the question of what was being done on U.S. soil, namely in Orlando, Florida, and directly before the coup attempt of January 8th in Brasilia, with Jair Bolsonaro being there and meeting with Brazilian allies and collaborators, including Anderson Torres, his former Minister of Justice and Public Security, who was later arrested by the Brazilian authorities after January 8th. I asked the question, was this ever fully investigated by the Biden administration and other U.S. justice authorities, including the possibility that U.S. laws were violated? And there's also the unanswered questions of possible foreign financing, including obviously U.S. financing, to support the January 8th insurrectionists in Brazil. Now, obviously, the current Trump regime has absolutely no incentive in seeking answers to all these questions. I do want to make the point that the messages that were sent by the Biden administration to the Brazilian military in 2022, to the Bolsonaro administration prior to the Brazilian elections, were very, very clear, and this was brought about also by the visits of Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and of CIA Director Bill Burns at the time, was that the United States was not going to look favorably, would not support any kind of coup attempt if there were an election result unfavorable to Bolsonaro. This was not insignificant, and modesty aside, there's certainly those of us in the progressive community, including Washington Brazil office and the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil, were certainly urging the Biden administration to take these positions. And currently, there's no question the current Trump regime inspires Lula's far-right opponents in Brazil, as Alex and Jana have pointed out. Bolsonaro's ultra-right-wing allies in the United States are attempting to take advantage of the situation by denouncing the current Lula administration and its institutions, maintaining that the current STF, or Brazilian Federal Supreme Court, including minister or justice, they're called ministers, but we consider them justices here, Alexandre de Moraes in particular, who is certainly no progressive if one examines his biography, have been violating human rights by bringing to justice those responsible for the January 8th insurrection. The Brazilian right wing and its allies in the United States, including Eduardo Bolsonaro, who's currently, on leave from the Congress and living in Texas, are advocating for U.S. sanctions to be brought against Brazil to force the Brazilian authorities to stop the January 8th prosecutions and ultimately override the decision of the Brazilian Superior Electoral Court, which bars Jair Bolsonaro from seeking elected office until 2030. But of course, the Supreme Federal Court recently decided that Bolsonaro must stand trial for treason and insurrection, given his involvement with January 8th, including there being an accompanying conspiracy to murder President Lula, Vice President Alckmin, and Justice Moraes, although Bolsonaro is not specifically charged with attempted murder. Now, although this webinar is entitled How Brazil Beat Back Authoritarianism, there is the question as to the future, especially given the authoritarian regime in the White House and its ties to the Brazilian ultra-right. Now, in 2024, last year, Brazil and the United States were celebrating the bicentennial year of official diplomatic relations. And prior to the November elections in the United States, there appeared to be some basis for the case of a new unwritten alliance between the two giants of the Western Hemisphere, recalling that term, unwritten alliance, having been coined by the historian E. Bradford Burns when he was writing about Brazil-U.S. relations during the time of Brazil's First Republic from 1889 to 1930. For example, the Washington summit meeting between Presidents Lula and Biden on February 10th of 2023 produced an aspirational blueprint to maximize the potential of the relationship with the strengthening of democracy, promotion of international human rights, and the joining of forces to confront the climate crisis being at the center of the agenda. There was a commitment to reinvigorate the Brazil-U.S. Joint Action Plan to eliminate racial and ethnic discrimination, as well as advancing the objectives of the UNFCCC, or the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. And on September 20th, 2023, something I was very much involved with personally, Biden and Lula inaugurated the joint U.S.-Brazil Global Partnership for Workers' Rights in New York, the first time that both countries had launched an ambitious labor rights initiative at the presidential level for the benefit of workers in Brazil, the United States, and the rest of the world. So Trump's electoral victory in November of 2024, followed by his inauguration on January 20th of this year, has pretty much brought this to a screeching halt. He certainly was not President Lula's preferred outcome. As Lula told journalist Kennedy Alencar in February of last year, although I'm not an American voter, I obviously think that Biden is more of a guarantee for the survival of the democratic regime in the world and in the United States. And after Biden dropped out of the presidential race, Lula reportedly told allies in September of 2024, God willing, Kamala wins the U.S. election. Now, after Trump's victory, President Lula posted on social media that the world needs dialogue and joint work to have more peace, development, prosperity. And on this same message, he wished the new U.S. administration luck and success. However, he didn't call President Trump personally to congratulate him. And although both leaders attended the funeral of Pope Francis at the Vatican last month, they did not meet or directly converse on that occasion, contrary to a lot of speculation by the Brazilian press on that possibility. So considering the current geopolitical and global economic order, Lula and Trump appear to be diametrically opposed. Lula continues to advocate for multilateralism and lowering protectionist barriers to international trade, with Trump appearing to say and do the complete opposite. So I'm going to stop here for now, Alex. Look forward to elaborating on the future, particularly with regard to civil society relations during our reflection period.
Thank you very much, Stan, and really appreciate you going into those causal links that I think need to be investigated further. Not sure who's going to carry out that investigation on the U.S. side anyway. Probably not the Department of Justice, but the links between the January 6th and the January 8th insurgency, which could have, of course, they had tragic outcomes. They could have had far more tragic outcomes for both countries. And so next we have Gonçalo Beron, who is project director of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Brazil and is an associated fellow of the Transnational Institute. He has a PhD in political science from Sao Paulo University. He's an Argentinian who has lived in Brazil since 2000, practically Brazilian, and he has played an active role in facilitating the Hemispheric Social Alliance and the campaign against the FTAA while working with the Central Única dos Trabalhadores, CUCI, and later with the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas. As a TNI Transnational Institute Fellow, he pushed for the launch of the Global Campaign, which led the process toward a UN Treaty on Human Rights and Business. And recently, he facilitated a social movement mobilization to stop corporate capture of the United Nations. So we're very honored to have Gonçalo here with us. Please take it away, Gonçalo.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Thanks, Manolo and comrades from IPS, and thanks Stan and Jana for the wide introduction on the issue. Very, very complete, by the way. I don't have so much to say in it, but I will try to bring some more elements from my perspective, our perspective here as activists, as well as as an analyst and people thinking about what's going on here. The main thing that I have to say is, as Stan remarked, there is a structural situation here in Brazil that is not solved, and is still a threat to democracy and to democracy as we know now. Because even if we had a legal and strong answer to the events of January the 8th and the follow-up of that, we still have some structural support as well from society to Bolsonaro and to the right, no, not only the far right, but a wider right that align behind him, and that's the most concerning dimension of the current situation, and what make us still be alert and mobilize against that situation. No, the thing is that the situation is not easily change. I mean, we have difficulties in dealing with that, and in a way we may think of a structural change in the Brazilian society. A bit of what Jana has explained, and a situation that is coming since more than 10 years already. A bit of that was expressed or started in a way, as Jana said, in June 2013, where this expression of a change in the Brazilian society was or went to the streets against Dilma, and everything started with a simple thing that was an increase on the basic ticket for public transport, that was 10 cents. There was a mobilization against that, and it was a simple mobilization from a progressive network for public transport, but that became a kind of a huge monster. Indeed, they used this metaphor as the monster was awake, Brazil awake, and it was an expression that started being kind of progressive and ended being completely regressive, and show in a way how the structurally the society was started to change, and how that could be expressed politically or electorally, you know. Because that was the beginning of an anti-petismo, as we call that, anti-PT party and governments and so on. A bit of that was expressed already by Jana when she explained the role played by the so-called middle class. That is a little lower than your middle class in the U.S., but it's kind of a middle class that has some privileges. Some of them described already by Jana, and with the policies by Lula, and so that those privileges, as for instance having somebody to take care of the house caring, let's say, or the restaurants, or the private schools, or flying and having holidays, and that kind of thing was seen as a threat to their own privileges, and that was expressed first in this June 13th mobilizations, but later on politically, no, and that was why, even if the Dilma's government was a solid one, a very bold one, there was a slight push or pressure or inflation pressure in those years, but it was a very slight one, but that was used as kind of to push for a change, and that mobilized a lot this middle class, no, and this middle class started to develop this anti-petismo, very solidly, let's say. And yes, on top of the socioeconomical reasons they may have, started the problem with the corruption, the lavajato and so on. The thing was that the whole institutional system became as well anti-PT. So the Supreme Court that now is protecting, let's say, the Republican system and democratic system in Brazil with Alexandre de Moraes and company, that is okay. At that point, worked the other way around. So it was kind of a lawfare against Dilma, and after that they came for Lula. So in a way, it was a swing movement, a pendulum movement move from the highest tribunal, no, the Supreme Court here in Brazil. But at that point, they aligned with this anti-petism that the society became after the election of the second election of Dilma, in dialogue with this structural situation I was describing. No? So at a certain point, that was kind of the context where the impeachment and we call the coup, and that was the first coup against the PT government and the first coup, the first threat to democracy we live in the recent history of Brazil, and it's that kind of the real DNA of what we have today as a structural support from Brazilian society to the far right and different expression of the right. No. There is another thing that should be put there. That is a kind of a second or third element that came after that. That is the of course after the impeachment, the neoliberal policies really led by Temer really destructure or broke what the agreement Lula created in the previous years, no, mostly involving social policies and so on. Bolsonaro deepened even more that. And then we have a new situation where the state was no longer kind of the one offering answers to problems, no, to structural problems as poverty, access to health, education, and so on. No? And there was kind of a situation where new poorer sectors embrace these new offers, and that's something that hadn't been said, but must be said because it's important. And this is when or where first the religion dimension, but also what we call I don't know how to say that, Jana, the acolhimento. How to say that in sorry to I mean the caring of people that before that was done through the Catholic network and through the trade unions network or through the state policies was broken. And a new actor or two new actors enter into that game from a very conservative perspective, which are mostly which is mostly the evangelical church, the Protestant church that were not hegemonic before this, before recently, but became hegemonic with a super developed, well-developed network, very rooted in the popular sectors in the Brazilian society. With super conservative values. I guess that you have something, maybe it's not similar in the US, but it's close to this. And through that network, remember that Bolsonaro and all those guys became evangelical themselves and make political deals with that sector, promoting very conservative values. And that was really massive and help. It was complementary to the situation described before with the middle class. So this is the kind of the set of sectors. Let's say it's a huge part of the society, Brazilian society, that support, and that's why it's kind of structural nowadays. We have to add to this the fact that the unions are no longer as strong as they were. No, Stan described this a little bit, but it was not mentioned here, the fact that the nature of work really changed. And you know that's not a Brazilian phenomenon, but it's a phenomenon here in Brazil. And the basis of the unions as we knew them are being undermined by this new entrepreneurship model of work, not the platform style of new jobs and so on. No? So these two elements are very very crucial, let's say, to give support to this far right or right political expression of the Brazilian society. So that's to be considered, mostly because we have many challenges. I have to say as well that that this has a political expression, and it's not only the public support, let's say, to Bolsonaro and other right-wing leaders, but also through the parliament, because this was very rooted in the deep Brazil. So the deep Brazil, that is a mix of rural Brazil with less developed or more conservative Brazil, embraced this set of values and so, and elected hundreds of, or many tens, hundreds, I could say, of MPs that are the so-called Centrão, that is going there and going here, supporting or not Lula, but always threatening him. And it was the core of the alliance that impeached Dilma. No? So this is a structural situation that we have to consider, and it's part of the persistence of the right and the constant threat to democracy and the democratic system and the democratic forces. We have to understand, for instance, that this is key in something that is very obvious, that all the guys that did the January the 8th should be in jail. Some of them are, and some of them are being processed by the Supreme Court, but there is a strong move against that, for an amnesty, a pardon to them. That may include, of course, Bolsonaro and his gang. That could be unthinkable, but it is part of the reality today. So, and the society is kind of saying, yeah, maybe not, but why not? No? So it's in a way very difficult. Finally, I would like to say something about the coalitions that make possible the defeating of Bolsonaro. No? And of course, nobody mentioned that it's so clearly, but I will have to say this very clearly. That is that many of this depends on Lula, no, and his figure and so on and so forth. So that's key. And because we tried to defeat Bolsonaro with Fernando Haddad, and we didn't manage. Lula was in jail or blocked. No, was not in jail, but no, he was in jail. Yeah, but he couldn't run for in 2019. And Haddad, that was the other candidate, didn't manage manage to defeat Bolsonaro, and that was why he came on board. So, or he won the election. So the figure of Lula is key to understand all this. On top of that, what I could say is something related to the social alliances and the political alliances. Regarding the social alliances, here were mentioned the two blocks or the two fronts And those who are familiar with Brazilian politics, they know that one block, one front was the one linked to the PT plus, and the other one was the one linked to the PT and the MST, and the other one was linked to the more PSOL, that is another party, and the MTST, the homeless movement. But it was kind of just a slight difference, let's say. But they coordinate a lot of their actions and mobilization, and those were key to struggle against the impeachment, no, mostly during the Temer times, no. But another element that's kind of progressive leftist movement, no? The unions, the landless movement, the black movement, the women. I mean, all the main social movement.
Gonzalo,
Yes, I had to
Gonzalo,
finish.
I
had to
hate
finish.
to have to cut you
No,
off.
it's
but
okay.
we need a little
But
bit of time for the Q&A.
one sentence is that there was another important articulation, so coordination, that was something that finally was called the Pacto per la Democracia, Pact for the Democracy, that was with more center liberal forces that managed to gather not only progressive but some center liberal social and political forces that were identified with the Tucanos, with the mostly with the Fernando Enrique Cardoso's party, and that was key because it was kind of a societal consensus that democracy should be protected, and that Pacto for the Democracy was the way they expressed that. So thank you very much. I'm sorry to be so long, like a Latin American.
No, thank you, Gonzalo. I'm sorry we don't have more time just now, but we do have the Q&A, so you'll be able to speak to some of these issues a little bit more. But thanks for that, really that great sort of sociological explanation, really, of the strength of the far right in Brazil today, and of course a lot of very disquieting parallels with the U.S. there as well. But I want to turn now to, and we'll try to keep this to about 10 minutes at most, a few initial questions to our panelists. And I'll start with Stan. Stan, you presented us with I think, extremely challenging picture of the current situation in Brazil, given sort of the ongoing threats of these authoritarian offensives that are, of course, enabled by the current authoritarian regime here in the U.S. And I was wondering, given this context, if there's really hope for the future of Brazil-U.S. relations just now, and maybe particularly in relation to the trade union and progressive sort of civil society solidarity.
Thank you, Alex. And I'll try to respond to that question, even though it's tempting to do it within 5 minutes is a kind of mission impossible. I do want to pick up, though, if you just allow me, very, very quickly on a point which Gonzalo made. I think it's worth noting. It's about the elections in 2018 when Lula was in prison. The polls were, I think it's very important to mention that. Notwithstanding all the anti-petismo, which permeated the society and which was there clearly in 2018. And it was also clearly there during the period of the impeachment and the parliamentary coup, as it were, against Dilma in 2016. But polls were indicating that in 2018 in the elections that Lula could very well have won, even from prison. He would have won had he been permitted to run. And that is a very, very significant point. And that notwithstanding all of the anti-petismo on the part of much of the middle class and upper middle class, there still was great popularity for Lula, with the understanding, particularly by working classes and the poor, that the social inclusion that had been fostered by him, but also by Dilma as well, but certainly Lula being seen as the charismatic representative of that, made him extremely popular. notwithstanding this kind of right-wing anti-PT reaction permeating the society. And I'm biased, but I think he would have won had he been allowed to run. And why wasn't he allowed to run? Well, there was a law which actually he had signed when he was during his second term, known as the Ficha Limpa, or roughly translated clean slate law, which very simply stated that if your criminal conviction were sustained in an appeal, that you would be disqualified from seeking political office. That was what Lula was hung. That's what they hung Lula on with regard to that. That's what the Superior Electoral Court had decided. Even though, according to international law, Lula should have been able to run. Brazil had ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966, and the UN Committee on Human Rights in Geneva and the rapporteur had reported out that Lula should be able to run, including from prison, that he had that right based on the covenant, which Brazil completely disregarded the international law that they had ratified. But another point is that even within the clear slate law, there was a section, inciso 26C, section 26C, which basically says that if there is a plausibility that on further appeal you would prevail on the merits, your disqualification could be suspended. And it could have been suspended in Lula's case, and it was done for dozens of politicians running for the municipal elections in 2012. So excuse me for making that point, but I think it's an important historical footnote, contemporary historical footnote. To get to the point about the future relations, former U.S. ambassador.
And Stan, in 2 minutes, if you don't mind, because
all right. Well, very quickly. Yeah. Tom Shannon, former U.S. ambassador to Brazil, has said the partnership defines the relationship with Brazil and the United States as not only one of governments, but of society. It's something that he wrote in Brazil in 2021. So his point would suggest the strength of Brazilian-U.S. civil society alliances is now more critical than ever before, including alliances between the labor movements, environmental movements, human rights and immigrant rights advocates, gender and racial equality advocates, academics, and many others. And so when we're also focusing on government-to-government relations, this should not be limited only to the executive branches at the federal level for obvious reasons. So the links in exchange between members of the legislative and judicial branches of both countries, which have existed throughout the years, are now more important than ever before. Consider the critical role, for example, of the Congressional Progressive Caucus here to the Lula Livre movement, saying no to further coups in Brazil, but also links with state and local governments are very strategic to the future of the relationship. It's most likely Trump administration is not going to send anybody to COP30, given the exit from the Paris Climate Agreement, and COP30 will be hosted by Brazil and Belém do Pará in November of this year. But there's great potential for American involvement. There are obviously the environmental movement should be there from the United States in full force, but also many state governors, city mayors, as well as members of Congress could be there. So the links between civil society organizations, members of the judiciary, the legislative branch, and state and local governments taking as a whole make for a promising dynamic for the future. And this dynamic could serve as a counterweight to the excesses of the Trump regime, including its noxious, destructive tariff policy, its threats to democracy and rule of law, its willful disregard for environmental protection and sustainability, its rejection of multilateralism and global institutions, and its waging on immigrants, including Brazilians living and working in the United States. The problem with this is that sort of the U.S. government support to this kind of civil society alliances is gone. Thanks to Trump, thanks to Musk, thanks to Doge. I mean, for example, there is no continued U.S. government support for the Brazil-U.S. government partnership for worker rights since all the relevant funding at the Labor Department has been slashed. But I'm going to conclude now by saying that Brazilian and U.S. civil society organizations need to meet these challenges by taking the initiative themselves. For example, the Brazilian-U.S. union movements need to try to restore the partnership on worker rights, seek other allies, including in the existing multilateral Empower program, which was inaugurated during the Biden administration to advance global freedom of association and collective bargaining rights. Empower has participation of friendly and pro-labor governments, including Spain and South Africa, for example. So I'll conclude by saying these cultural and societal alliances between Brazil and the U.S. are essential to maintaining and advancing this critical relationship between the two largest powers in the Americas. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Stan. And very quickly, Jana, if possible, well, please try. If you could just touch on how Lula's current economic and international policies are impacting the political landscape in Brazil.
Okay, yeah, that's also a question that's pretty impossible to answer quickly, but just to give a very, very, short comment, as short as possible, I would say Lula right now is caught between a rock and a hard place. Like I said, I think I wouldn't say that Brazil effectively beat authoritarianism, completely, right? Like based on, I think Gonzalo mentioned, gave a really good overview of how rooted, this sort of far right movement is now in Brazilian society as well as in Brazilian politics, and obviously it was always rooted in Brazilian economy, right? Because again, it's economy that was inherited from slave owners, right? So you have a situation which, Lula came to office with, high expectations. Obviously, the number one expectation was to, reinstate, preserve democracy and democratic institutions, which arguably I think he's done very well. Again, if you see, especially on the role of the judicial branch in terms, the fact that Bolsonaro is going to be tried, the fact that, just today, a news, Carla Zambelli was a very high profile far-right member of Congress. She's going to be going to prison for 10 years for threatening, the legal system and threatening Lula's voters with making armed threats to Lula's voters during the elections in 2022, so those are very good signs, right? But at the same time, the sort of social and economic aspirations that many of Lula's voters had in 2022 have not been fulfilled in large part because there's incredible fiscal restrictions being placed on the government, again, because it's a government that is part of this broad front for democracy, which includes the neoliberal right. Again, they're pressuring, Lula to not overspend, that Brazil, in this sense, the economy is actually doing quite well. Unemployment is quite low. It's, again, similar to those Dilma years where you have a slight inflationary pressures and the far, not the far right together with the neoliberal right is saying, okay, we're going to use this to pressure the government to raise interest rates and to slash to gut fiscal policy, right? And so what does that mean in practice? It means in practice that I work at a publicly funded federal university, funded by the federal government. We just got an email a few days ago saying that our budget is being slashed. We went, months without getting a raise, even though our, Lula promised to increase funding for public education. So again, it's part of the problem is in the nature of the coalition. Part of the problem is obviously now this pressure coming from the global markets, which obviously Lula does not control, the real is a relatively weak currency right now. And I think part of the answer to this is going to be Lula consolidating stronger economic and political ties with other South American countries, and Latin American countries, strengthening these regional organizations like CELAC, which is meeting today, and most importantly, Lula consolidating his relationships with China and other BRICS countries, which he is also doing successfully. So I do have optimism that he can find a way, he'll be able to thread this needle out of these pressures, both by the far right and the neoliberal right.
Thank you, Jana. And of course, what you've described is something that it will generate or has generated an enormous amount of resistance, not just within right-wing sectors in Brazil, but also here in the U.S. and from the current administration, which I don't think is very fond of BRICS, although they've done pretty much everything to motivate countries like Brazil to throw themselves further into the BRICS project. But we're now short on time. I want to start addressing some of the questions from our audience. And there are a few questions, and I'd like a few questions that point in one direction, which is really if the panelists could reflect a little bit more on sort of the key takeaways from the Brazil experience for progressives in the U.S. and everywhere, or simply for those who want to defend democracy, based on Brazil's experience with authoritarianism, not just under Bolsonaro, but also under the military dictatorship, and in terms of effective campaigning, mass mobilization, the international solidarity movement. Again, a huge question, and I'm just going to have to ask you to respond very quickly. And I'd like to start with Gonzalo, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. There is a basic lesson, let's say, that is unity. No, you have to build a united front for democracy, and maybe that's not done there, but that was key here. No, because you, in a way, you disqualify the attempts to say that everything was anti-PT and so on. You dismantle that contradiction here, and that really helped in embracing the democratic system as a whole in a solid way, and that was key. And that's, from my point of view, the most important lesson, and kind of the message I would like to leave with you. So, not to steal you so much time, okay?
Thanks. Anyone else from our panel?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in there. This is, I'm going to put on a little bit more of my hat as a member of the Democratic Socialists of America right now. And I think, first of all, the main lesson is that fascism will not go away on its own. It needs to be actively combated. Luckily in Brazil, we had the Workers' Party. We had other parties like PSOL, which Gonzalo mentioned, which took on the fight, which didn't say, oh, we're just going to take it on the courts or just bury our head in the sand and hope it goes away. And even today, the fact that the far right hasn't, grown as much as it potentially could have, and that you have Bolsonaro ineligible, is not just because you have an active judiciary. It's because you do have people in the streets, protesting for women's rights, protesting to make sure that these coup plotters don't get amnestied. You have obviously activism from the left-wing members of Congress to stop the worst sort of neo-fascist agenda from passing. You have activism from Lula himself in the executive branch. So I think the most important thing is that, and the other thing is that we also have to remember, for most ordinary working class people, democratic institutions, especially in a country like the United States or Brazil, these institutions which really have just been used for hundreds of years to prop up these elites, they don't really mean a lot to a lot of people. We have to combine, we can't just only be talking about defend democracy. We have to link that concretely to the economic needs of ordinary working class people. One of the reasons that Bolsonaro was also defeated is because of what he did during the pandemic, because the economy did so badly, because labor rights got gutted under even more under Bolsonaro. So I think, again, we have to link these sort of abstract ideas about defending democracy under Trump or any other authoritarian government to actual strengthening worker rights and social rights for working class people.
Dan.
I would just basically say amen to both what Jana and Gonzalo have commented. It is unity. It's actually looking to see that we, as parts of civil society and progressive civil society, and I'm basically going to be talking about my own home. That's the labor movement, organized labor. But we have to think. Really in broad coalition terms, and not just rhetorically and abstractly, but actually to do it, to organize, and to actually be willing to take on the system. I mean, again, there's a lot of we don't know what the future of labor law is going to be in the United States, quite frankly, and clearly the forces of the ultra right and those of the attorneys representing Musk and the other plutocrats in this country are challenging the Constitution, I'm just using this as an example, the constitutionality of the whole National Labor Relations Act, the board. All right, well, if you're going to go that route and you're going to challenge like this existing legal structure, and right now we don't have an operating National Labor Relations Board because of a lack of a quorum at the top, and that's not an accident. That's very, very intentional. This can cut both ways. For example, okay, we're not going to have recourse to actually, with regard to redress unfair labor practices against workers and trade union rights, but all the restrictions, if you're going to declare the whole system off with regard to, on our side, which would be considered unfair practices in terms of secondary activity and more broad solidarity activity, those restrictions could be taken off too. I only use that. It's kind of a more microcosmic perspective based on the labor movement to say that we have to think beyond. I'm not talking about illegal action, but I'm talking about really thinking beyond our boundaries as institutions, and that we have to, and after we join. And that is the great lesson of Brazil. And that was saying everything that Jana did very, very well to point out how historically elitism, racism, and still the legacy of slavery still dominates social relations and economic power in Brazil, as it does in this country. But still in Brazil, and ultimately the whole movement for democracy and to end dictatorship in Brazil was based on effective popular response. That's what has to exist in the United States. And I think, just to conclude, we should look at this history and particularly contemporary history of the post-military dictatorship period in Brazil to really inspire us to really resist and to move forward in this country.
Thanks very much, Stan. And we have a lot of questions. I have to apologize in advance because we really can't get to all of them today. But one question that I can ask the panelists immediately is if they can share their contact information, if they'd be willing to do that, because I think that would be one way of getting the responses that people would like to have from all of the panelists, because we're not going to be able to get to them all, and of course to follow up afterwards. And there's someone, for instance, who would like to know how they can do more in DC. Someone else would like to know how they can do more in terms of, activism and participating in the movements against fascism in Brazil. So if you could share your contact information, that would be great. And then we have a few questions that we don't really have time for. You can blame me, the bad timekeeper, but on the sort of regional dimension again, and what the Lula government is doing to sort of strengthen itself among sort of progressive forces in the region, or to kind of be a counterbalance to some of the far right in the region. And so I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that very quickly, but we're going to have to conclude within just 2-3 minutes.
Just one initiative that is taken by Lula together with Boric from Chile and Sanchez from Spain. They are promoting a kind of a dialogue on democracy that started in September last year in New York during the General Assembly's meeting, and it has a follow-up this year. A meeting is going to happen here in Brazil in late June and late May, and another one at top level is going to be being organized by Boric, but together with Lula, Sanchez, Petro. I guess that the Uruguayan new president is going to join. So in a way, it's spreading the idea or a mobilization for democracy, pointing out some dimensions that are key for that, which are the misinformation processes, fake news, and so on. The the defense of the institutions, and finally the inequality as a base for the raising of fascism and far right.
Thank you, Gonzalo. So we're going to wrap up. I just like to say something quickly about the importance of the solidarity movement with Brazil here in the U.S. I think all of us here, the panelists, folks at IPS and so on, have been involved in all of that for years now, since these attacks against democracy, the impeachment, the coup against Dilma in 2016. You had, you know, the expats for democracy, the Brazilian expats for democracy in Brazil. I remember them, a bunch of young, mostly Brazilian women here in the DC area that helped mobilize members of Congress. The US Network for Democracy in Brazil, unions played an extraordinary role. And, you know, this had a real impact on congressional members, and they spoke out, you know, at very critical moments during the coup against Dilma, during the judicial persecution of Lula. And Stan mentioned this letter from Hank Johnson. There were 2 letters signed by a number of members of the House Judiciary Committee, asking pointed questions to the U.S. Attorney General, to 2 U.S. Attorney Generals about, you know, the role, the involvement of the Department of Justice in the Lava Jato, you know, persecution that took place against Lula and others, and never got good answers. Again, this was really critical in everything that ended up happening in Brazil, including, of course, the 2018 electoral victory of Bolsonaro. But, you know, members of Congress also spoke out. Thanks to all this sort of grassroots pressure, they spoke out against the attempt of Bolsonaro to overturn the election results and against the January 8th insurgency. So I'm just mentioning this because Brazil has another election, a presidential election next year. And of course, the far right remains strong and very much emboldened by you know, what's happening here in the U.S. in the Trump administration. And the far right is very well organized between the 2 countries and regionally. And so, you know, progressive forces need to also be coordinated and organized against, you know, this far right anti-democratic threat. And we're leaving you with a few resources that you'll see in the chat here. And I'd like to mention as well that there will be another session of this series on June 19th. It will be Authoritarianism and the Weaponization of Social Media with IPS fellow Sanyo Tree. So we hope you can all make it to that. This is a wonderful series. Thanks very much to IPS for doing this, and it's so very timely, and I hope we can you know, learn from many more examples of what's happened around the world in the fight against authoritarianism and fascism. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, guys.